Camilla already had a seat at the most closely watched table in Europe. Diana had been gone for years and was no longer there to claim it, and Charles, after waiting for so long, felt that at last no one could deny him what he had silently wished for over decades, for the world to accept the woman he loved. But there was one problem: the table was not his. It belonged to his mother. And his mother still decided who sat where. All of this began long before there was a wedding to remember, with a tiny moment that Diana could never erase from her memory: a gold bracelet, 2 engraved initials, and a secret that should never have reached her hands. G and F, Gladys and Fred. The private nicknames Charles and Camilla used for each other long before the public even knew there was a third person in that marriage. Diana discovered it just a few days before walking down the aisle. And yet she went through with it. For nearly 10 years, Queen Elizabeth II kept that woman at a deliberate distance. No shouting, no palace scandals making headlines. When she finally decided to act, she did not need a public scandal, a single document, a rewritten order of precedence, and an instruction that the entire royal family would have to obey in silence were enough. If you're interested in stories like this, the ones that are not told in the headlines but in the palace corridors, stay with us, hit the like button, and subscribe to the channel. We aim to honor Diana's memory with accuracy, verified sources, and without resorting to cheap rumors. Now let's return to that chair everyone thinks they know. You probably already have the quick version of this story in your mind: the affair, the separation, the devastating divorce, and Charles and Camilla's 2005 wedding. But knowing the Wikipedia summary is not the same as understanding what happened behind closed doors. Between those headlines, there was a face-to-face confrontation that Diana herself would later describe as one of the bravest acts of her entire married life. There were years of silent resistance from the Queen. There was a carefully calculated public relations campaign to reconcile Camilla with British public opinion. And finally, there was an internal court document that reorganized Camilla's rank within the royal family. A document that revealed in black and white that acceptance had very precise limits. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what Queen Elizabeth II did, why she took so long to give in, and what that long resistance cost Diana, Charles, Camilla herself, and also William and Harry, who grew up watching this story unfold around them without anyone ever asking whether they agreed with it. To reconstruct this story, we rely on the testimonies collected by Andrew Morton from the secret recordings Diana herself made, Prince Harry's memoir Spare, the investigative work of Christopher Anderson, the royal reporting of Katie Nicholl, and Tom Bower's biography Rebel Prince, which, according to its author, is based on more than 120 testimonies linked to the royal household. We also refer to bodyguard Ken Wharf and Diana's former private secretary Patrick Jeffson, 2 men who witnessed this story from completely different perspectives. Because, in the end, this is not just the story of an empty chair, it is the story of who had the rightful claim to sit in it. On July 29, 1981, more than 750 million people around the world stopped in front of their televisions to watch a 20-year-old woman walk down the central aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral. Diana Spencer wore a dress that filled half the screen and a veil that seemed to have no end. To the rest of the world, it was a modern fairy tale turned into a religious ceremony, but Diana herself walked toward the altar carrying a burden the public still knew nothing about. Weeks before the wedding, Diana discovered that Charles had commissioned a piece of jewelry for another woman. It was not a vague suspicion or palace gossip. According to the recordings she herself gave to biographer Andrew Morton, she discovered the gift just 14 days before the ceremony, a gold bracelet engraved with the initials G and F, the private nicknames of Camilla and Charles. The blow was devastating. Diana confessed to her sisters that she no longer wanted to get married. The response she received was brutal in its simplicity. It was already too late to turn back. Her face was already printed on commemorative mugs, magazine covers, and in the collective memory of an entire nation. There was no stopping the machinery, so Diana went ahead with the wedding anyway, carrying the truth inside her like a splinter. Camilla, for her part, was not a stranger in this equation either. Biographer Penny Junor maintains that Camilla knew Diana beforehand, considered her a suitable match for Charles, and never openly opposed the relationship. That does not prove that Camilla personally chose the future Princess of Wales, but it does confirm something unsettling. She had been present since the very first chapter of this story. She did not appear later as a secondary character. Years later, Charles would insist that he remained faithful to his marriage until it had become, in his own words, irretrievably broken. His authorized biographer, Jonathan Dimbleby, places the rekindling of his relationship with Camilla around 1986. By 1989, Diana no longer had any doubts about it. Many people remember exactly where they were on the day of the royal wedding. The dress, the veil, that kiss on the balcony of Buckingham Palace that brought an entire nation to a standstill. What almost no one saw was the parallel story unfolding behind closed doors, away from the cameras. Diana saw it, and in 1989, she made a decision that would change the way she faced everything else. She would stop acting as though she knew nothing. I felt completely out of place, like a fish out of water, but I decided to fight with everything I had. I was going to make myself noticed. That is how Diana described those years in the recordings that eventually reached Andrew Morton. She was not speaking like a woman protected by a system that looked after her. She was speaking like someone who had already understood one fundamental rule: if she did not defend herself, no one else would. That same year, Diana accompanied Charles to a private celebration in Richmond for the 40th birthday of Annabelle Elliott, Camilla's sister. It was familiar territory for Charles and Camilla, a social circle they had shared for years. It was not Diana's environment, and she knew it perfectly well. The other guests knew it too. Even so, she attended. Ken Worf, the bodyguard assigned to Diana during those years, later recalled that her arrival caused an almost physical reaction among those present, as though the party had frozen for a moment. The remarkable thing was that Diana had not yet spoken a single word. The tension did not arise from anything she had said, but simply from the fact that she was there, in a place where no one expected to see her so early in the evening. Diana looked around the room. Charles was there, Camilla was there too, but at one point both of them disappeared from sight. Diana did not ignore it. She found Worf among the guests and told him, according to his own account, "You have to come with me, I can't find my husband or Camilla." It was not a casual remark made over drinks. It was a clear decision. She was not leaving that house until she found out where they both were. Worf accompanied her as they searched the property room by room. Eventually they went down to the basement. According to his testimony, they found Charles and Camilla sitting together on a sofa, talking with at least one other guest present. Up to that point, Worf could accompany her. What happened next belonged to Diana alone. She asked the men in the room to leave and let the two of them speak alone. She wanted to talk to Camilla without witnesses, without bodyguards, without anyone who might soften what she was about to say. There were no cameras waiting outside. There were no journalists lurking nearby. There was no audience ready to applaud her courage. Just two women, face to face, and a truth that had remained unspoken for far too long. What they said to each other in that basement comes to us mainly through Diana's own later account. There is no recording of that conversation, and Camilla never publicly offered her own detailed version of those minutes. That is why it is important to tell this scene as Diana remembered it, not as though it were a word-for-word documented fact witnessed by a neutral observer. According to Diana's testimony, she looked directly at Camilla and said something like this: "I know exactly what's going on. Stop treating me as if I'm stupid." She was no longer asking Charles for explanations. She was no longer waiting for someone else to confirm what she had known for a long time. This time, she chose to confront the person at the very center of it. Diana recalled that Camilla responded by reminding her of everything she already seemed to have in her favor: the admiration of the public, enormous popularity, and two beautiful sons. Then, almost defiantly, she asked, "What more do you want?" Diana's reply was short and final: "I want my husband." Nothing more needed to be said. Those words did not come from a position of victory. Diana was still trapped in a broken marriage, surrounded by people who knew far more about Charles and Camilla's closeness than she did herself. But for the first time, she had forced Camilla to hear out loud what so many others preferred to ignore for the sake of convenience. The conversation ended. Diana walked back upstairs. The party continued, at least on the surface. But for her, the night had changed completely. Worf remembered the drive home as one filled with tension. Diana was in tears while Charles remained cold and distant. There was no sudden reconciliation, no explanation that fixed anything. They left that house together in the same car, but emotionally they were farther apart than ever before. Biographer Ingrid Seward, who followed the royal family for decades, has said that the encounter left Diana so shaken that she could barely put her emotions into words. Worf even described that night as a turning point, the moment it became clear that the marriage was approaching its end. But here is the detail that completely changes the meaning of that scene. Diana did not remember it only as a painful moment. In her own words, she called it one of the bravest acts of her entire life as a wife. She did not choose a TV interview to tell the truth. She did not choose a press statement. She chose a basement with no support from anyone, standing face to face with the woman she believed had become the third presence in her marriage. Why did that moment matter so much to her? Because Diana left that house without winning Charles back, but with something she had never had before. She had spoken the truth aloud to the right person. No one could ever again convince her that it was all in her imagination. No one could demand that she keep smiling while pretending not to understand what was happening around her. That confrontation in the basement did not save the marriage, of course. In December 1992, then Prime Minister John Major officially announced to the House of Commons that Charles and Diana had formally separated. 3 years later, on November 20, 1995, Diana sat down in front of the BBC cameras for the programme Panorama and spoke to an audience of nearly 23 million people in Britain, with an estimated worldwide audience of 200 million. This time, what had happened in a private basement became a matter of global public knowledge. Shortly after that interview, the Queen wrote directly to both Charles and Diana, recommending that they resolve their situation through divorce. The process was finalised on August 28, 1996. Diana had confronted Camilla in private. She had taken the truth to the entire world on television. But on August 31, 1997, she died in a car accident in Paris. From the outside, it seemed as though the last obstacle standing between Charles and Camilla had disappeared. Many assumed that Camilla could now move without resistance into the place Diana had left behind. But there was still one woman standing between Camilla and that position, the woman who controlled the titles, the official invitations, and every detail of British royal protocol. And that woman was not yet prepared to step aside. According to biographer Tom Bower in Rebel Prince, during a private conversation at Balmoral in the summer of 1998, Queen Elizabeth II reportedly said something as direct as this to her son: "That wicked woman. I want nothing to do with her." There is no recording of that meeting, so it should be understood as Bower's account rather than a publicly confirmed statement from the Queen herself. Even so, the remark fits perfectly with the pattern of resistance already visible in Queen Elizabeth II's actions during those years. Everything had changed on August 31, 1997, when Charles received the news of Diana's death while still at Balmoral. Bower claims that the prince repeatedly said in anguish, "They're going to blame me, aren't they? The whole world is going to go mad." Diana had died in Paris, but the shock spread across Britain at a speed no one inside the palace had been prepared to handle. Flowers, letters, and photographs began piling up outside the royal palaces in numbers never seen before. A Gallup poll found that half of the British public experienced Diana's death with a level of grief comparable to losing someone from their own family. Among women, that figure rose to 57%. Charles knew perfectly well that much of the public directly associated him with the suffering Diana had endured. Camilla was even more difficult to present in that atmosphere. Her name remained tied to the breakdown of the royal marriage and to the famous line Diana had spoken before millions of viewers that there had been 3 people in a marriage meant for 2. Some later accounts claimed that Charles's popularity fell as low as 4% after Diana's death. Reliable polls from the time do not support such an extreme figure. What they do show clearly is a deep resistance among the British public toward any attempt to present Camilla as the future wife of the heir to the throne. Inside the palace, the problem was even more personal and far more uncomfortable. Royal journalists Katie Nicholl and Robert Jobson have written that Queen Elizabeth II avoided openly acknowledging Charles and Camilla's relationship and that Camilla's name was rarely mentioned in the Queen's presence. These claims come from anonymous palace sources, but the Queen's public decisions during those years reflected exactly the same carefully maintained distance. In November 1998, Charles turned 50. The Queen hosted a reception for him at Buckingham Palace the evening before, so it would be unfair to say she completely ignored her son's birthday. But the following day, the major private celebration took place at Highgrove, with Camilla serving as the official hostess. Queen Elizabeth II did not attend. Prince Philip did not attend either. Charles's siblings stayed away as well, with the sole exception of Princess Margaret. William and Harry were present that evening. Reports at the time offered scheduling and availability as explanations, but the underlying message was difficult to ignore. The Queen could celebrate her son, but she was still unwilling to appear at an event hosted by Camilla. Charles understood the difference perfectly. That same year, according to Bower's account, he tried to persuade his mother to soften her position, to accept the relationship once and for all, and to stop treating Camilla as someone who had to remain on the margins of royal life. The conversation reportedly took place at Balmoral after the Queen had enjoyed several drinks. According to Bower, Queen Elizabeth II replied that, as Supreme Governor of the Church of England, she could not approve of adultery, nor was she prepared to forgive Camilla for remaining close to Charles while he was still married to Diana. It was then, according to the same account, that she spoke the now famous words, "That wicked woman. I want nothing to do with her." The story continues by saying that Charles left the conversation deeply upset and called Camilla in tears. No one outside that room could confirm every exact word that was exchanged. However, other biographers described a very similar coldness on the Queen's part. Christopher Wilson attributed to Queen Elizabeth II an even more direct refusal. She did not want that woman in her presence under any circumstances. Christopher Anderson wrote that the Queen's feelings toward Camilla went beyond formal disapproval. For years, she reportedly felt a deep and genuine personal dislike for her, and Charles was not facing resistance only from his mother. The Queen Mother was also firmly opposed to Camilla becoming part of the royal family's inner circle. Robert Jobson wrote that Camilla's name was not welcome in the Queen Mother's presence either. Biographer Tom Quinn even argued that Charles would have found it nearly impossible to marry Camilla while his grandmother was still alive. Mother and daughter represented, in practice, two different generations of authority within the monarchy. Queen Elizabeth II controlled the institutions present, while the Queen Mother retained enormous family influence and embodied its most traditional values. As long as both remained opposed, Camilla could continue to be Charles's private companion, but never a fully accepted member of the royal establishment. Charles, however, had no intention of giving up. If he could not overcome that resistance through difficult family conversations, he would try to change public opinion first. To do that, he needed someone who understood the inner workings of the British press, someone who knew exactly how much power a single well-placed photograph could have, and someone capable of turning 15 seconds in front of a group of cameras into a national event. That man was Mark Bolland. Patrick Jepson, who served as Diana's private secretary for 8 years, later wrote that any honest explanation of Camilla's rise would have to acknowledge that her true place in Charles's past and in the country's future had been hidden behind a long series of carefully crafted palace statements. Jepson understood palace language perfectly. He knew that a carefully written sentence could conceal just as much as it revealed. After Diana's death, that institutional language began to change deliberately. Mark Bolland joined Charles's team in 1996 and became Deputy Private Secretary the following year. His mission was extraordinarily delicate: rebuild the prince's public image and make it possible for Camilla to appear beside him without triggering another national backlash. In various media accounts, the strategy became known as Operation PB for Parker Bowles. It was never presented to the public as a campaign to make Camilla queen. In fact, Bolland later explained that, at first, marriage was not even part of the discussion. The initial question was far more modest. Could Charles and Camilla simply spend time together in public without having to hide as though they were committing a crime? The first step was to gradually get the public used to seeing them together. They could not begin with an official ceremony or an appearance alongside the Queen. That would have been premature and counterproductive. They needed an elegant but unofficial event, a private occasion with enough media interest to attract the press, and above all, an exit that could be photographed without ambiguity. The opportunity came on January 28, 1999, during the celebration of Annabel Elliott's 50th birthday, the same sister of Camilla, this time at the Ritz Hotel in London. The internal plan received a new name, Operation Ritz. Bolland discreetly alerted the media. Nearly 200 photographers waited outside the hotel that evening, some even standing on portable ladders to get the perfect angle. Charles and Camilla gave no speeches, answered no questions, and barely paused in front of the cameras. They simply walked out of the hotel together. For just 15 seconds, camera flashes lit up the entrance of the building, and that brief walk brought an end to more than a decade of separate arrivals, discreet departures, and constant efforts to avoid the photograph that would publicly confirm what the entire country already suspected. A later ITV reconstruction of Operation Ritz confirmed that the appearance had been carefully planned by Bolland. It was not a lucky coincidence, it was a meticulously designed public introduction. The photograph appeared on the front pages of virtually every newspaper in the United Kingdom. Most importantly for Charles's team, it did not trigger the public relations disaster that many had feared. With time, media coverage of Charles steadily improved. Some biographies credit Bolland with a dramatic rise in Charles's approval ratings, from around 20% to nearly 75% over the following years. Those figures come from different polls and should not be interpreted as one continuous measurement, but the overall trend is undeniable. Charles was beginning to regain public support, and Camilla was slowly ceasing to be someone who could only appear in secret. For the palace strategists, this represented significant progress. For William and Harry, however, the situation was far more difficult to accept. They were not watching a simple public relations campaign from the outside, they were witnessing, in real time, how the woman associated with their mother's suffering was being introduced, step by step, into their father's public life. Every photograph that Charles's team celebrated as a small victory could, at the same time, reopen an old wound for his sons. Tom Bower wrote that Camilla's constant presence served as a continual reminder to the princes of the suffering their mother had endured, and he also claimed that there were times when both brothers tried to avoid uncomfortable encounters within the royal residences. These are accounts offered by a biographer, not direct, verified testimony from William. Harry, however, would later tell his own version of events in his memoirs. In Spare, Harry recalled his first formal meeting with Camilla at Highgrove and compared it to getting an injection. Close your eyes, endure the uncomfortable moment, and hope it ends as quickly as possible. He was just a teenager trying to make sense of a situation that the adults around him had already turned into a carefully planned public relations strategy. Years later, Harry wrote that he experienced deeply conflicting emotions about having a stepmother in his life, and that he came to believe he had been, in his own words, sacrificed on the altar of my father's public relations. That is Harry's personal interpretation of events, not independent proof of Camilla's intentions, but it clearly reveals how he experienced, from the inside, the image campaign unfolding around him without his consent. In his interview with Anderson Cooper on 60 Minutes, Harry explained why he believed that strategy was dangerous. He said his father needed to rehabilitate his public image and was building strategic relationships with the British press. In a family organized by strict hierarchies, he argued, that kind of process could leave people, or as he put it, bodies behind. Harry believed he had been one of them. While Camilla's new public image was being built brick by brick, Diana's own words continued to echo. Not because anyone needed to invent what she had felt, but because she had already said it herself with complete clarity on November 20, 1995. There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. She also explained during that interview that she did not see herself becoming queen of the country. Instead, she wanted to be the queen of people's hearts. She spoke of an institution that, in her view, had decided she no longer fit the role it had assigned to her from the beginning. And when she was asked why a strong woman could seem so threatening to that institution, she replied that strong women throughout history had often walked similar paths because genuine strength always creates confusion, and even fear in those accustomed to control. Nearly 23 million people in Britain watched that interview live. The estimated worldwide audience reached 200 million. From that point on, it was no longer possible to dismiss the conflict as mere tabloid gossip. Patrick Jepson later described Diana's genuine fear that she would never find emotional fulfillment within a home marked by a lack of affection, and Charles's constant preoccupation with Camilla. Diana could not know how the story would end, but she clearly understood that her husband's public life was being rebuilt around a relationship in which she had always felt displaced from the very beginning. She died 21 months after that interview. After her death, the campaign to present Charles and Camilla as a stable couple moved forward with a precision that would have been impossible while Diana was still alive. First came the Ritz appearance, then came carefully selected charity events, meticulously planned public engagements, and a gradual step-by-step process of public acceptance. But one approval still mattered more than all the others. In the year 2000, Queen Elizabeth II agreed to attend a gathering at Highgrove where Camilla would also be present. Royal spokesperson confirmed at the time that the Queen believed the moment had finally come to show a certain degree of public acceptance. For the first time since the relationship had become public, the 2 women shared the same space at a social event. Newspapers at the time described it as the end of the standoff. Charles saw it as a long-awaited personal victory. Camilla had finally managed to enter the same room as the Queen. But being admitted into the same room did not automatically mean receiving the place Diana had once occupied within the royal hierarchy. Years later, when Charles and Camilla's marriage forced the palace to formally define Camilla's position, Queen Elizabeth II would establish a written limit. And that decision would show that the apparent acceptance at Highgrove still came with very specific conditions. According to Katie Nicole, the Queen had spent years reluctant to officially acknowledge Camilla, but eventually agreed to sit at the same table during a celebration at Highgrove honouring the 60th birthday of the exiled King Constantine of Greece, a cousin of the British royal family. Nicole described this June 2000 gathering as the event that gradually transformed the relationship between Queen Elizabeth II and Camilla. Charles hosted the celebration at Highgrove for Constantine. Around 100 guests attended, including both the Queen and Camilla. Mark Bolland had spent years working toward precisely this moment. First, he had introduced Charles and Camilla to the public outside the Ritz. Then he had helped normalize their appearances at smaller public engagements. Now only one image remained: Camilla being accepted at a gathering attended by Queen Elizabeth II herself. The biographical accounts agree that the 2 women shared the same table that evening. Contemporary press reports confirmed that they attended the same celebration and described the meeting as the end of a long publicized period of distance. It was not a warm reconciliation or a lengthy conversation. Camilla performed a formal curtsy. The Queen greeted her politely. They exchanged a few formal words and maintained the decorum the occasion required. There was no visible confrontation, but neither was there a warm public welcome. That is precisely why such a small gesture carried so much symbolic weight. Queen Elizabeth II did not need to deliver a speech. Her mere presence signaled that Camilla was no longer completely excluded from the family circle. The newspapers called it a historic breakthrough. For Charles, it was tangible proof that his mother's resistance could soften with enough time. After years of constant refusals, the two women had shared the same space without causing a public crisis. But that acceptance had very clear limits. The Queen announced no formal change in Camilla's position within the family. She granted her no new title. Nor is there any evidence that she returned to the palace that night and immediately began drafting a document against her. The protocol that would later define Camilla's exact place was still 5 years away. What had unquestionably begun, however, was a slow and carefully controlled thaw. In February 2002, Camilla was included in a celebration connected with Queen Elizabeth II's Golden Jubilee at Buckingham Palace. Katie Nicholl interpreted that invitation as the official end of the most visible hostilities. Camilla was no longer appearing only as Charles's private companion, she was gradually entering the institution's public family circle. Even so, one figure whose opinion still carried enormous weight remained. The Queen Mother. She died on March 30, 2002, at the age of 101. Several biographers, including Christopher Anderson, have suggested that Queen Elizabeth II would never have approved Charles and Camilla's marriage while her own mother was still alive. No public document confirms such an understanding, but the Queen Mother's death undoubtedly removed one of the most significant sources of family resistance. Camilla attended the funeral on April 9 of that same year. Her presence did not go unnoticed. According to later accounts, before the service she held a private meeting with Charles and Queen Elizabeth II to discuss whether the time had finally come to integrate her more visibly into the royal family. The door was no longer completely closed. 3 years later, Charles and Camilla officially announced their engagement. They were married on April 9, 2005 in a civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall. It was a small ceremony with only 28 guests. William and Tom Parker Bowles served as the official witnesses. Both Charles and Camilla came to that civil ceremony as divorcees. Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip did not attend that part of the wedding. The official explanation was that the couple wanted to keep the civil ceremony private and low-key. Because the Queen was the supreme governor of the Church of England, her absence attracted especially intense media attention. However, Queen Elizabeth II did attend the service of prayer and dedication held afterward at St. George's Chapel. Prince Philip stood beside her throughout the ceremony. The Queen also personally hosted the reception afterward at Windsor Castle. That detail is extremely important. Not attending the civil ceremony signaled a deliberate distance. Attending the religious blessing and hosting the reception simultaneously conveyed royal acceptance. Both messages were delivered on the same day, almost as if the Queen wished to send two different signals to two different audiences. Camilla also received a title chosen with extraordinary care. Upon marrying the Prince of Wales, she was legally entitled to be known as the Princess of Wales. However, that title had become almost inseparably linked with Diana in the public mind. For that reason, it was decided not to use it. Instead, Camilla became known as the Duchess of Cornwall, taking the feminine form of one of Charles's principal titles. This was not because any law explicitly forbade her from using Princess of Wales. It was a strategic decision intended to avoid direct comparisons with Diana, and to prevent a public reaction that might still have been too intense at that time. During the reception, the Queen presented a much warmer image than many had expected. The Grand National Horse Race had taken place earlier that afternoon. Queen Elizabeth II, a lifelong enthusiast of horse racing, publicly compared Charles and Camilla's relationship to overcoming the race's most difficult fences, specifically mentioning Becker's Brook and the Chair, two of the course's most famous obstacles. She then expressed her pride in both of them and wished them every happiness in the future. The guests laughed openly. Author Jilly Cooper later recalled that the speech had the entire room laughing. Tom Bower interpreted the speech as showing that although the Queen avoided addressing Camilla directly by name, the overall message was clearly supportive of the couple. Queen Elizabeth II had attended the religious blessing, personally welcomed the guests, and sincerely wished the newlyweds happiness. In public, the Cold War finally seemed to be over. Yet the marriage created an institutional problem that could no longer be solved with a clever joke or a carefully chosen title. The wife of the heir to the throne, Camilla automatically acquired a very high position within the formal hierarchy of the royal family. It became necessary to decide, with almost mathematical precision, who bowed to whom, who entered each room first, who walked ahead during official processions, and in strictly private gatherings, who actually held the higher place of precedence. The answer to all of those questions was laid out in an internal document prepared under the direct authority of the Queen titled, Precedents of the Royal Family to be Observed at Court. What that document established regarding Camilla revealed, without ambiguity, that public acceptance did not mean she could occupy any position without restriction. In spare, Harry remembered his father's final decision to marry Camilla this way. Even though Willie and I begged him not to do it, my father went ahead with his plan. We shook her hand and wished them well, with no hard feelings. It was Harry's personal version of a deeply private and complicated family moment. William has never publicly offered an equivalent account, but according to Harry, both brothers feared that the marriage would reopen all the inevitable comparisons with their mother's memory. The wedding went ahead nonetheless, and with it came the unavoidable question of Camilla's exact rank. According to traditional British precedents, a wife automatically shares her husband's rank whenever she appears beside him in public. Since Charles was the direct heir to the throne, Camilla could occupy the position immediately after the Queen whenever she appeared with him at official events, placing her ahead of other women in the royal family in those specific circumstances. Private family gatherings, however, followed completely different rules. In 2005, Queen Elizabeth II prepared the internal document mentioned earlier. It was not a law passed by Parliament. It did not alter Camilla's marriage or strip her of any official titles. It was simply an instruction for members of the royal family and court officials regarding the exact order that should be observed within the private life of the royal household. The new arrangement applied the principle of royal blood whenever the women of the family were not accompanied by their husbands. Under those specific circumstances, Camilla ranked behind Queen Elizabeth II, behind Princess Anne, and behind Princess Alexandra. The Queen's daughter and a princess born into the royal family therefore held official precedence over the future king's wife. That placed Camilla fourth among the senior women in those strictly private settings. But one condition was extremely important. Whenever Charles was physically present, Camilla shared his rank and automatically moved up in the order of precedence. When she appeared alone, however, the princesses born into the royal family were entitled to walk ahead of her. The Queen had not expelled Camilla from the family, nor had she destroyed her institutional position. She had simply established a very precise boundary in writing so that no one would have any doubt about the correct order. At a royal dinner, Camilla could not walk into the room and personally choose where she wanted to sit. In fact, no one within that system could do that. The host approved the seating arrangement and royal protocol determined, with almost microscopic precision, who took precedence over whom on every occasion. There was never a single physical chair permanently reserved for Diana that had remained empty for years like a silent monument. The place referred to here was institutional, a position within a complex hierarchy, not a specific piece of furniture in a particular dining room. Queen Elizabeth II did not dramatically pull away a chair in front of a room full of astonished guests. Instead, she acted in the traditional manner of the British monarchy, through a quiet instruction that the family and court officials simply had to obey, without any public explanation. Whenever Camilla attended a private event alone, Princess Anne and Princess Alexandra walked ahead of her in the order of precedence. That was, in essence, the true meaning behind the much-discussed gesture. There is no official explanation confirming that Queen Elizabeth II made this decision specifically to protect Diana's memory. To claim that as an established fact would go beyond what the available evidence supports. The arrangement may have reflected accumulated family tensions, the traditional principle of royal blood, public opinion, or a complex combination of all those factors. What can be established with certainty is the concrete outcome. Camilla was the lawful wife of the heir to the throne, but she did not automatically receive first place among the women of the royal family in every private situation.